What is up? The NFL season, regular season, has come to an end. We gave you a little bit of a recap last week, but we are going to get into it this week in No Punt Intended, and we are here to talk about fantasy football MVPs. Maybe it's the guys who got you to the playoffs. Maybe it's the guys who won you the championship. Maybe it's just somebody you stole in the draft. That is what today's show is all about. Ryan hosting, no Joe Zolo, but me and Josh are ready to have a fun one. Let's get into it. What is up? Welcome to No Punt Intended, presented by Club Fantasy. I am your host, Ryan Weisse, with Joe Zolo taking some days off for hockey. With me, as always, Josh Hudson. Welcome, Josh, to the first show, your first show of the fantasy offseason.
Oh, my first show, yeah. I don't know about all that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, your first No Punt Intended of the fantasy offseason.
I was about to say, I just got done recording 6 videos. So.
Not to mention the way too early draft we did on Monday. If you guys did not check that out, that was probably one of the most fun shows we've done. And it's a new tradition that I think we will be doing from this point forward, because what a way to wrap up our Monday show. If you guys go to our YouTube page and look for the way too early 2025 draft, you are going to learn some things. I felt like it was one of the best shows we put together recently, Josh.
And honestly, it lends itself right into this series of shows, really, because, you know, when you're drafting way too early, it's very much an instant reaction to what happened in 2024. So all these shows that we're doing this month, it's all about how we can take this information from 2024 to basically craft our strategies throughout the 2025 offseason and, you know, plan and prepare for the 2025 season and hoisting more of those trophies.
Yeah, it's actually a really good point, because I just brought up the board because it didn't even occur to me until you said that like a lot of these guys we're going to talk about, people might be interested to know where they went in that mock draft. Mm-hmm. So I got
good
that.
Good thing
up.
You have that handy, actually.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm glad I was able to get to that quickly. It's almost like I do way too many mock draft shows and can get to those things very quickly. Guys, if you thought the show was over when the regular season ended, you're absolutely wrong. No Punt Intended goes 52 weeks a year. Every Wednesday, we're going to be here for you. This is kicking off what we used to call like our accountability. We're not going to so much talk about accountability, but we are going to talk about, this week anyway, the most valuable players in fantasy. Before we do so, I do want to remind you guys about a great partnership we have going on with Trophy Smack. If you need a championship belt, if you need a ring, if you need wall art, if you need anything to get you through the fantasy season, get you ready for next fantasy season, make sure you use the link in the description of this video or our promo code WOFF. Josh, if I remember correctly, the ring promo is still going on, correct?
Correct. So from now until January 31st, if you get a championship trophy or a championship belt and use promo code WOFF, that's WOFF, at checkout, you can get yourself a free championship ring. Just make sure that ring is also in your cart and it'll chop that off. And there you go. You get yourself a free ring.
There you go. You guys are probably still crowning champions and waiting on payouts. Hopefully not waiting too long on payouts. By the way, if you have a great fantasy commissioner or a terrible fantasy commissioner, make sure you guys check out Gator J's Twitter feed. He is doing a little case study on some fantasy leagues right now, and would love to get some input. He just put out a Google form that he is trying to get as much input as possible. Just retweeted it on my account as well. So make sure you guys look out for that if you can help our buddy Jay out. One person Jay did not help out, Josh. Our buddy from down under, Vince Mapstone, was not happy with the 11 a.m. Eastern kickoff, as it was 3 o'clock in the morning for him as he drafted with us. But
you know what? That's what I love about Vince, because even if he's upset about the time that we go live, damn it, he's going to be there. So you know what? Shout out to you, Vince, because that right there, that is a fantasy-aholic, and that's what we're all about.
Guys, we have subscription services and Super Chat. If you want to use them, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. You're probably not going to need to use Super Chat much in this show. The off season gets a little dead, but if you want to throw us a little money to answer your question, we'll get it on air as quickly as we see it. But those things are available to you. And also like, subscribe, do all the thing that you're supposed to do to help a YouTube page grow. We'd very much appreciate it. Josh, before we get started, we got a little bit of news and notes, and one of them pisses me off. Antonio Pierce fired as the Raiders head coach. So right now the Saints, the Jets, the Bears, the Jags, and the Patriots are all in search of a head coach. And I didn't get into this too much on Monday, and I feel like this might fly a little bit better on No Punt Intended than it did on Monday. I don't know how I feel about giving players an opportunity to be a head coach and then casting them aside because they didn't win you a Super Bowl in year one. And then, Josh, you know me well enough to know that what I'm about to say is not a surprise. I also don't like that we're hiring black guys and then firing them immediately, and it just casts aspersions on a league where this shit has happened for years. And I'm just getting a little bit pissed, specifically about Pierce. Like, you gave this guy jack shit to work with, and then you're going to let him go because what? Like, the Pierce one pisses me off way more than the Mayo one pisses me off. So,
yeah, I think with Mayo, it really just kind of felt like Robert Kraft backed himself into a corner, making him, basically writing this into his contract that Gerard Mayo was supposed to be the successor to Bill Belichick. So, Of course, he had to honor that, right? But with Antonio Pierce, and I've read some articles and, some opinions and stuff like this. When you look at the NFC West, look at the coaches, or AFC West, excuse me. Look at the coaches that are in that division, right?
It's a very well-coached division.
It's not only it's a well-coached division, but it's a lot of veteran head coaches, right? Like Andy Reid's tried and true. He's won Super Bowls.
Absolutely.
He's done this not just with the Chiefs, but also with the Eagles. You look at Jim Harbaugh, right? He was a banner hire for the Chargers. He led the 49ers to a Super Bowl, took Michigan to a national championship. And then you look at Denver Broncos. Sean Payton's won a Super Bowl, veteran head coach, right? Antonio Pierce is the new guy, right? Yep. He's the nerdy kid with the braces walking up to the varsity table trying to fit in with the crowd. And
what an interesting way to describe an NFL linebacker.
But again, like, that's really what it is, right? It's the popularity table. It's the table that everybody is accomplished sitting at.
Yeah. And
you're this kid walking up trying to fit in where right now you just don't fit in. And I think that, Mark Davis, obviously with Tom Brady in his ear, is like, look, Antonio Pierce, for how they ended the season, which, they won some games with not so great players, and they really sort of stripped down this roster, and they needed to, right? Like, they didn't have a ton of great players. But the ones that they did have were doing really well.
Yeah.
But Antonio Pierce made a lot of bad coaching decisions.
That's fair.
Not a lot of great coaching situations. And I look at this in, like, when you're applying for a job that maybe you're not the most qualified for, right? Like, it's one of those things where there's going to be a lot of on-the-job training.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, what it boils down to is your boss going to have patience for you to work through stumbling through this, learning curve, right? Well, when you're in a division with accomplished head coaches, 3 teams that made the playoffs this year, you need to ask yourself, do I have patience for this?
Yeah.
And Mark Davis said, no, I don't.
Which is no surprise. And everything you're saying.
And to me, that negates and overlaps. You didn't have a quarterback to win with.
And that's my issue, is it's not just that he didn't have a quarterback. It's not just that he had to go to the Desmond fucking Ritter well. They traded away his best wide receiver. Just a lot going on with that team that bothers me. Maybe it's just that I liked Antonio Pierce, plain and simple. Vince brings up a very interesting point, that a lot of these guys had to know they were transitional head coaches. And I don't think Vince is wrong. I just don't love the aesthetics of it. And I'm not going to get into the whole like geopolitical. I just don't like the aesthetics of it. I think it's an interesting and bad culture in the NFL.
The same thing that the Texans did, right? Dave Culley, Lovie Smith.
Yeah.
Before you ultimately land on D'Amico Ryans, when you finally clear out all the cap space and you get out from under all the dead money from the high-priced veterans and all this stuff, like, you can't lure the right head coach into situations like that. So you have to basically bring in whoever's going to accept the job and say, we're going to do what we can, get to where we need to be, hopefully, and then progress from there. It's just the sad reality of the NFL. And like you said, it's a bad look when majority of these coaches are black.
Yeah, that's the part. Like, it keeps happening to young black guys. I'm like, this just does not look great for the NFL. But I will say, Josh, we've done shows together for 5-6 years now. The other thing you know about me is I just don't think anybody gets a good enough chance in the NFL. Like, I do not like how we just move on. We don't let anybody build anything. And
it's a what have you done for me lately league. It's the same thing. And that's why teams stay bad when they invest in these quarterbacks that don't pop in year one.
Yeah.
Plain and simple.
Yep. And then the other news, but before you get to the other news, Josh, I'm going to ask you if you saw this clip at all. There is a clip going around of Shad Khan being interviewed about keeping Trent Baalke. And it is a Zoom interview. And it's Shad on one screen, me and you right now, and Baalke on the other screen. And a reporter asks a question and says, if you hire a new coach and they have questions about the strength program or the something else or the GM, are you going to listen? And Shad Khan with Baalke right next to him is like, I'm going to ask them how they can improve it. And if their ideas are right, we'll work with them. So he basically just told Trent Baalke live on an interview, you're not safe even after I hire my head coach. So.
Well, Trent Baalke is a terrible GM for starters.
He is.
I mean, this guy has got to be one of the best used car salesmen ever, because how he keeps getting retained in jobs that he clearly sucks at, I don't know. I truly don't. Like, I'll give him credit for Brian Thomas Jr. Like, that was a slam dunk pick. You know, he's turned into a great wide receiver in year one, but like, you swung and missed in free agency.
Yep.
Like, in what world is giving Gabe Davis a 3-year, $13 million a year deal smart money, smart business? Like, it's fucking terrible. We all know what Gabe Davis is. Shit.
And I mean, and they overpaid. Everybody at the time thought they overpaid Christian Kirk, and he's played well when he's played, but it hasn't been that great. So like that often rather. So yeah, lots of bad decisions there, which brings me to another GM in that same division.
Which again, real quick, that's what's going to make hiring the head coach for Jacksonville that much more difficult, because there's already rumors going around that the top coaching candidates won't go there because of Trent Baalke. So if Shad Khan is going to put his legiancy behind Trent Baalke, you're going to end up in a scenario where you're turning over coaches year in and year out, because you won't get rid of the guy that clearly nobody likes.
Well, to be fair,
really that isn't good at their job.
He did say he's willing to listen this time if you have a better idea. Which brings me to the division rival Titans, who have fired Ron Carthon after 2 seasons. Josh, you have some very interesting notes here. I'll let you read them because you did the research on it, because I did not realize this. So.
Yeah, I mean, Ran or Ron, however you want to pronounce
I thought it was
his name.
Ron. Is it Ran?
I don't know.
I thought you mistyped it.
But like, the Titans spent the most money in free agency last year. It was about $332 million. They won 6 games last year. This season, they cut that number in half. They won 3 and now ended up with the first overall pick.
Yeah.
So like, I understand the logic here behind, well, Rand set this team up. They clearly didn't deliver. You're the one that brought these pieces in, so you're at fault. But here, I think, is the fairest of questions to ask. Was he the problem for bringing in the wrong players that didn't fit with what Brian Callahan and his staff wanted to do? Yeah. Or was the coaching staff at fault because Carthon brought in the right players, just didn't hire the right coach? Either way, at the end of the day, isn't he at fault because he signed off on Brian Callahan?
100%. And I was going to go back, Josh. I didn't like when they parted ways with Vrabel. I didn't think it was a great idea in this situation. And Vrabel still has the passion to coach. I just don't think that was the right decision for that team. I think maybe you bring in a more innovative offensive coordinator at that point, but I didn't like that direction.
But this is the thing, is that Vrabel's not an innovative offensive coordinator kind of guy. Every single offensive coordinator that he's brought in is more vanilla than the soft serve that you buy at any local ice cream shack.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, it's terrible. He is a we're going to run the football, we're going to play good defense, and we're going to grind and bludgeon people because that's the way that Bill Belichick did it.
Which is why he'll likely be the Patriots
is that when
coach.
you really look at it, the later championships that Bill Belichick won, it was on Tom Brady's arm in the offense. This whole mantra of play good defense and run the football is what wins you championships. That's 20 years ago. It doesn't happen nowadays. You can't have that mentality. You have to get with the times. Learn how to throw the fucking football. Mike Vrabel has never embraced that. And his choice for GM was ultimately the reason why he was ousted from that job, because ownership wanted somebody else.
Yeah. All right, Josh, we got a little bit of discussion going on in the chat before we move forward. Alec Morton just comes in to egg you along. Fly, Eagles, fly.
Let's go, baby.
I was looking
Best
at
team in the NFC, point blank.
I was looking at Vegas odds, not specifically on that game, but on total playoff games expected to be played. And I was a little shocked that the Eagles were not more highly ranked. I don't know what Vegas thinks they know that we don't know, but like just seems relatively impossible the Eagles lose this week. So I'm not too worried about that.
I don't know. I got into a very long discussion with our good buddy Hoove this morning where, you know, his gut feeling says that the Packers are going to upset the Eagles.
I don't buy it for one fucking second. I want to give a quick shout out to Joe Ortiz, who says he is putting off the Lincoln Lawyer for us. I appreciate that, Joe. Fantastic show. We binged it about a week ago. And our good friend, Chris Molina, is a huge fan of the show and actually told me he saw the Matthew McConaughey movie in high school, and it is what inspired him to go into law as a profession. So I thought that was very, very cool with discussions I've been having with Chris. But Josh, this is the one we need to get to before we start the show. This is Millie and Gator having a bit of a battle in the chat. Millie, a Falcons fan, Gator, a Buccaneers fan. Is Mike Evans better than Julio Jones, Josh?
More consistent.
Certainly.
I think talent-wise, it's Julio Jones for me, and quite frankly, it's not as close.
I think if I have to win
some people might think
a game, a play, I'm going Julio Jones. If I need to win a season or a decade, I'm going with Mike Evans. Because I was thinking about this question, because obviously I'm a huge Mike Evans fan. I was thinking about this just independently this week of like, where does Mike Evans rank in my best receivers ever? And I'm not going to put them in any particular order, but you have to go with like the three GOATs, Jerry, Randy Moss, and then Terrell Owens, however you feel about him. He put up the numbers. And then I think the two kids in the game right now, Jefferson and Chase, probably belong in this conversation. And so then I started thinking, like, is this where Mike Evans goes for me? Is this where Julio Jones goes for me? Like, there's so many other players that I'm obviously leaving off this list. But what Mike Evans has done, yeah, Calvin Johnson and Julio could go in a similar conversation that Calvin Johnson just did it better. But it's so much that you could do there. But like what Mike Evans has done 11 seasons in a row, he's never been the A1 dominant guy. And he's also proven that you can take him out of a game. But my God, I just love the way that guy plays.
No, I love the way that he plays. He's never truly been like a savvy route runner. It's always been his ability with contested catches. My biggest thing with Mike Evans, especially when you're comparing him to somebody like Julio Jones, Mike Evans, while he's put up some gaudy stats, he's not somebody that truly can take over a game.
Yeah, that's fair.
In my opinion.
And Julio, Megatron.
Julio has done that many, many times where it's like, I'm going to get this football and I'm going to make you pay. And to me, that's what separates a really good wide receiver from an all-time great.
So I'm going to throw up Vince's comment, and then I'm going to throw in the guy that I forgot to mention, AJ Green over Evans and Julio for Vince. And the guy I wanted to kind of compare Mike Evans to, though they did it very differently, is Larry Fitzgerald. Because Larry Fitzgerald early on in his career played the game differently than he did late in his career. But obviously he had the longevity that Evans is kind of showing right now. But Larry Fitzgerald, I mentioned, if I need to win a game, if I need to do this, if I need to win one singular catch, I think I'm throwing the ball to Larry fucking Fitzgerald. Larry
Fitzgerald has the best hands of anybody in NFL history. I get that.
More tackles in his career than drop passes. My favorite statistic that you'll ever find in the NFL. So I thought that was fun for the chat. And Josh, we're talking about the great wide receivers. It's time to get into the great of 2025. These are our discussion for fantasy MVPs. I'm going to give you guys the qualifications, how we have decided to break this show down. And then if you guys have guys you want to throw out there, you can drop them into the chat. We'll do our best to discuss it. The qualifications, how we are deciding to break this down. We are looking at overall production. How did they do on the entire body of the season? So who is your fantasy MVP just based off of the season? We're looking at the best value relative to ADP. Who was a discount? Who helped you? Who did you walk out of the draft and helped you win a championship? And then who was featured on the most championship teams? Who are the players that took over from weeks 15 to 17 when the games mattered most? Josh, let's go ahead and get started with overall season production. And I'm going to list some players here, Josh. And guys, if we forget anybody, drop it into the chat. So Josh, I'm going to just rattle this list of players that I think we need to talk about their overall season production. We're not going to talk about all these guys because we'll be here all night, but let's talk about some of the important ones. Lamar Jackson, QB1 on the season, 434 fantasy points. Josh Allen, QB2 on the season. Joe Burrow, QB4 on the season. Then we jump to the running backs. Jahmyr Gibbs, what a season. RB1. When I was out here trying to convince people, could he be the RB1? I talked myself out of it.
You distanced yourself from it, and you know what? You would have been right.
I would have looked like a fucking genius. Saquon Barkley, RB2, only running back over 2,000 rushing yards this season. Bijan Robinson, RB3. Derrick Henry, RB4. What a resurgence in Baltimore. Moving to the wide receivers, Jamar Chase, wide receiver 1 on the season. 400 fantasy points, just led the field. Justin Jefferson, the other LSU wide receiver, at wide receiver 2. Amon-Ra St. Brown at wide receiver 3. Looking at the tight ends, Brock Bowers, tight end 1. Trey McBride, a very close tight end 2. At a points per game, these guys were basically tied. And then George Kittle actually beat both of them, finished as a tight end 3, but had more points per game. Josh, I think we need to start with the quarterbacks. And Lamar Jackson, for some, he's the MVP. For others, he's not the MVP. But he had better numbers this year than he did in his previous MVP seasons.
Yeah, I mean, he was the consensus QB4 based on ADP heading into the season. Roughly about a 4th-round draft pick. Finished as a QB1, as you mentioned. He was the number 1 scorer overall in fantasy. And he scored 75 more fantasy points than Josh Allen as the QB2. We talk all the time that QB is a very easy position to fade because you can get great value later. We'll talk about the value section a little bit later in the show. But when you have a quarterback or really any player at any position that scores that many more points than someone else, you are creating a positional advantage. That is what an MVP is, right? Yeah. We talked about it with Travis Kelce over the years.
I was just going to say, it's why we used to pay up for Travis Kelce.
That's why you pay up for Travis Kelce, 100%. And what I find really interesting is that, yes, Lamar clearly was a positional advantage at the quarterback position. He actually wasn't the only player in the NFL and for fantasy football that truly created a positional advantage. And we'll get to that player in a little bit. But yeah, with Lamar, it leads all the quarterbacks in rushing. Hardly a surprise. It's what he does every year. 915 yards, added 4 rushing touchdowns. He is the first quarterback in NFL history to throw for over 4,000 yards and rush for more than 800 yards.
I just wish he had hit 1,000, so he would have had a 5,000 season between a 4 and a 1.
That would have been like the equivalent of like a 50-50 season.
That's what baseball. I was thinking too.
Yeah, that's like a stratosphere in and of itself. But I still find it hilarious that people want to sit here and talk that Lamar can't pass. Joe Zolo.
Yeah.
Like, the man can throw the football. 4,100 passing yards and 41 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. Someone
made the running back joke in our comment section this season.
Yeah.
And I'm like, it's a terrible joke. Like, I remember now. It was, I think, one of our regulars where I actually like argued with them. I'm like, we got to stop talking like Lamar Jackson is not a quarterback. But I wanted to give Gator the last thing here because Gator talked about this. 4 interceptions, and he said, go back and look at them. He brought this up on Twitter the other day. None of them were his fault. To throw for 4,000 yards and only throw 4 interceptions that's what Aaron Rodgers used to do, Josh.
Yeah. And now, so basically you take the Aaron Rodgers MVP seasons and add on 900 rushing yards.
Does Aaron Rodgers have 900 rushing yards in his career?
He might not, honestly.
No, to me, Josh, it's bonkers that we're discussing anybody else for MVP. And I know if you're looking at who's the most valuable player to their team, you could make the argument for Josh Allen. But for the NFL, with what Lamar did shit this season that we've never seen before and we're likely to never see again, and that's the MVP.
Yeah, I mean, and here to me, when you're looking at overall MVP, taking the fantasy out of the equation, when you're looking at overall MVP, I'm not discounting Josh Allen. Simply, like, you can look at the numbers. Yes, Lamar Jackson tops him in numbers. Josh Allen basically didn't play 4 games.
Yeah.
He sat out the equivalent of 15 quarters. That's a lot. If he plays those quarters, what do his numbers look like?
He still has more pass attempts than Lamar already, though.
Well, and again, I mean, I get that, but that's what I'm saying. Like, now you add on the fact that he probably throws over 600 times. You add in what he could potentially do as a runner. Like, I'm not saying I disagree that Josh Allen is not the real life NFL MVP. I'm saying that I personally would take Lamar Jackson because I just think his season has been that much more spectacular. And with Josh Allen, it's a lot of projection.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I wanted to talk about a couple of other guys, but I know they're going to come up in the value section later on, so I don't want to hammer this too much. I do want to give a shout out to Joe Burrow, though. Led the NFL in yards and touchdowns, passing touchdowns anyway, and only threw 9 picks as well while throwing the ball like 200 more times than Lamar Jackson. So I don't want to give the impression that we are fading Joe Burrow here. It's just no fantasy managers, Josh, putting it bluntly, no fantasy managers are talking about Joe Burrow at the end of the season the way they are talking about Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen, plain and simple.
No, of course not. I mean, he doesn't provide the rushing value, right?
Yeah.
But what he was able to do with his arm basically equaled what they're able to do adding on all that rushing, right? Like we talk about, rushing is the upside play, right? There's the solid floor that comes with that, and it's built in. But ultimately, as a result, because they're running more, their passing numbers are down. That, truthfully, is what makes Lamar's season that special. Joe Burrow threw for 4,900 almost, 4,900 yards over, like 42 touchdowns, I believe it was. So, like, when you have somebody that's doing that type of production, not only is it boosting your fantasy team if you have Joe Burrow on your roster, but it's bringing up Jamar Chase. It's bringing up T. Higgins. T. Higgins set a career high in touchdowns this year. 10. Yeah. We always pencil him in for 6. He damn near doubled it.
Yep. Fizzle giving the proper shout out here to the Bengals defense for making sure Joe Burrow had to do that every single week. Josh, let's get out of here with one last question. A name that I'm probably a little surprised wasn't here, and I don't think he's going to come up on least valuable players because he's still the QB8. How do you feel about Jalen Hurts only throwing 18 touchdowns this year?
It's not surprising.
Okay.
I mean, this team was never going to be a pass-first team. We've seen it with we know that Jalen Hurts is capable of doing it.
Yeah.
But this team is always going to be run, run, run.
Yep.
Like, this is basically what they sat out to prove when they played Pittsburgh. Everybody said, you guys can't throw the football. So what did Jalen Hurts do? He said, all right, fine. We'll throw the fucking football. Get off our fucking ass. He threw what? 4 touchdown passes?
4 touchdowns.
He knows what he's doing. Like, he can make these throws. But this is how you keep Jalen Hurts from turning the football over. Because it forces him not to play Superman.
Yeah, that was a big issue
what
last
happened.
season.
Well, and in the first 4 games of the year before the bye week, he was turning the football over.
Yeah.
Because it was, I need to throw. I need to keep this game going because our defense isn't working. Well, they took the bye week. They regrouped. The defense has been the number 1 defense in all of football since then. And then look at what Saquon Barkley has done. But he hasn't needed to throw the football because Saquon Barkley has more rushing yards in the second half of games than all but 8 people, including himself, overall in the season.
Yeah, Josh, and that perfectly moves us over when we're breaking these down. We talked about the quarterbacks a little bit. Let's move on to these running backs because Saquon with the 2,000 yards notoriously didn't get a chance to go after Dickerson's record, but obviously it feels like it's Super Bowl or bust for the Eagles right now, and a lot of that's going to ride on those massive legs of Saquon Barkley.
Yeah, I mean, Saquon was that fucking dude. Like, I mean, anytime you rush for 2,000 yards, only 9 players in all of history have done that, including himself. But again, and I've said this, I think it was on Monday, Derrick Henry, 1,900 yards rushing. The only player in NFL history to have that many rushing yards and not lead the league in rushing.
Interesting.
Because Saquon Barkley was that damn good this year.
Yeah.
Because that offensive line in Philadelphia is the best offensive line in football, and you cannot convince me otherwise. But what I found
hilarious that you lose your leader on the offensive line and still had the best offense.
Oh, and by the way, his replacement was a Pro Bowler this year.
He did fantastic.
Yeah. Why do you think they drafted him? He's Jason Kelce light.
Yeah.
Who Jason Kelce basically handpicked and said, that is the guy that you need to replace me. Plain and simple.
I think it helps things, when Jason Kelce gives you the stamp of approval. So.
Yeah, 100%. But like with Saquon, a lot of the draft day fade with him was always, how many touchdowns is Jalen Hurts going to steal? And granted, he stole a lot. He had 14 rushing touchdowns this year.
Yeah.
Saquon still had 13. Like this is what it always baffled me with this, because we literally saw in this same offense 2 years ago, Jalen Hurts had 10 plus rushing touchdowns. Miles Sanders had 12.
And I think your argument at one point, Josh, was if Miles Sanders can do it, Saquon Barkley's going to be fine.
That's what I'm saying. Saquon tied his career high in total touchdowns this year at 15. And truthfully, it should have been more. Like, if he doesn't have a quarterback like Jalen Hurts, he probably scores 20, honestly. But this actually, because of the rushing yards, this was his fewest targets ever in his career in a season where he started 13 or more games. That is baffling. But this to me is kind of where the MVP case sort of like dies for me when it comes to Saquon. For as great as this season was for him, he scored less fantasy points this year than he did in his rookie season.
Yeah.
When he also
because he didn't catch a goddamn ball.
Because he didn't catch the football. Correct.
Yeah, I'm looking at
he scored 30 more fantasy points that year.
I'm looking at the top 10, and only Derrick Henry and James Cook had fewer catches than Saquon Barkley out of the top 10 running backs this season.
And again, when you look at Saquon Barkley, you're not thinking, how is this guy not catching the football? Because that's what he's done his entire career.
Yeah.
But in Philadelphia, with that offensive line and Jalen Hurts' ability to extend plays, they don't need to throw to the running back. And this has been a common theme for 4 years now.
Yeah, I think it makes a ton of sense. And then Josh, flipping it to the other side, Jahmyr Gibbs steals that number one spot off of him because of his ability to catch the ball. But even Gibbs didn't do through the air kind of what everyone expected him to do, which is hilarious to say about a guy who is third in the NFL in receiving yards from the running back position. And I believe fifth in catches from the running back position, sixth in catches from the running back position. But those catches were enough. Though he had 600 fewer yards than Saquon rushing the ball, he picked up an additional 300 running the ball. And by the way, scored 3 more touchdowns because he had that extra game, where he scored 4 touchdowns.
Well, I mean, Jahmyr Gibbs led all players in total touchdowns. He ended up with 20 touchdowns on the season. Obviously, week 18 played a role in that. But, I mean, you literally wrote about it. Why can Jahmyr Gibbs be the number 1 overall RB? Like, you were literally making that case.
Yeah.
Well, this is why. Detroit has a fantastic offensive line. Not quite as good as Philly, but they have a good offensive line.
Yeah.
And they score a ton of touchdowns because it is a high-octane offense. And now you fit a high-octane player in that high-octane offense. RB1 happens.
Yeah, things tend to work out well when that happens. Josh, I didn't get into this with the quarterbacks, but let me backpedal a little bit. In our way too early mock draft on Monday, Lamar Jackson goes in the 5th round. Josh Allen still went ahead of him in the 4th round, and then he's followed by Jayden Daniels and Joe Burrow. We're going to talk about Daniels a little bit later. Josh, I think the shock of the draft was that Jahmyr Gibbs fell all the way to the 1-7 to our good buddy Vince. Now, that was the product of a Christian McCaffrey auto pick. But Josh, looking at what Jahmyr Gibbs did this season, and you kind of point out like Saquon had this great year, but it wasn't even as good as his rookie season. Jahmyr Gibbs had this great year, but it wasn't a totally dominant year as an RB1, and he was kind of helped along by week 18, which isn't a big week in fantasy. Gibbs falls in as the 7th pick of the draft. How do we feel about that?
Well, I mean, if you buy into, look, I'm trying to lay off of running backs that have more than 300 touches, which is why people are probably fading Saquon Barkley. Guess how many touches Jahmyr Gibbs had this year?
I know he had 250 carries and probably 302?
302, exactly. Correct.
Yeah, I was going to say, I thought it was 52.
And now he has the playoffs.
That's true as well.
So if you're going to fade Saquon because of total touches, where does Jahmyr Gibbs, who's like 40 pounds lighter, fall into that?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So look, I'm not fading Jahmyr Gibbs because of that. Truthfully, again, he's in a high octane offense. They get him in space. This is where he does the damage because he's a guy that relies on his speed and his elusiveness and contact balance as well. Is extremely good. But this offense bleeds touchdowns, plain and simple.
Yeah.
Even with David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs was scoring touchdowns. At one point, actually, while they were active together, had more touchdowns than David Montgomery. And that's why we were all high on David Montgomery, because he was the guy that was getting all of the short yardage touchdowns. They use both of them very interchangeably. And we saw it more this year. David Montgomery was used quite a bit in the passing game as well. So there's zero reason to fade Jahmyr Gibbs. And the more that I look at it, I'm really strongly considering moving Jahmyr Gibbs ahead of Bijan in my RB rankings for 2025.
Yeah, I'm not deep into my RB rankings right now, but
I'm not saying I am either.
I've openly said Gibbs and Saquon are my 1 and 2. I just don't know what order I would take them in right now. Full PPR, I'd probably still lean Gibbs, though it's not like Bijan. Bijan actually was targeted more and caught 9 more balls this season. What Bijan didn't do, Bijan had 1 receiving touchdown to Gibbs's 4, and people are going to scream touchdown regression. You need to learn something about a Dan Campbell offense. There is no touchdown regression, baby. It's to the moon every single season. Unless this man gets hurt, I'm not concerned about touchdown regression, but I do love both of those backs next season, and I'm not going to be concerned if I end up with either one. We didn't give Bijan the notes he deserves, but to put it bluntly, he had a hell of a season on a mediocre team, and he wasn't as good as Saquon Barkley and Jahmyr Gibbs. So we're going to move on. Josh, what's that?
I said that's basically what it is. I mean, both him and Gibbs top 1,400 rushing yards, but you look at the disparity in yards per carry. Bijan had over 300 carries, 4.8 yards per carry. This is where I talk about the electricity of Jahmyr Gibbs, 5.6 yards per carry on 250 carries.
Josh, I think the name everybody was expecting to hear on this show, and I don't think it's any surprise, is Ja'Marr Chase. So I'll let you go ahead and get us started on Ja'Marr Chase. I found some pretty fun stats on him as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was the consensus wide receiver 4, which honestly felt high because I feel like so many people were fading him based on the contract holdout.
Yeah. And
like, I remember doing a draft, and I've talked about this on Monday's Anxiety. Like, I drafted a team for someone in my work league, and Ja'Marr Chase fell to the 203 in that draft because people were fading him because of the contract holdout.
Yep.
Like, I started that draft for her with Jahmyr Gibbs and Ja'Marr Chase. Like, that's how that went. And I was like, are you kidding me?
She won that championship, right?
No, she didn't, because she ran into fucking Jonathan Taylor in the semis, and Jalen Hurts got hurt.
Yep.
The irony, she scored 60 more points than the guy who beat her in the championship.
Of course.
Because that's how fantasy works, right?
Yeah.
But I digress. Anyway, but no, Ja'Marr Chase, and we talked again with Lamar Jackson with the positional advantage. Ja'Marr Chase scored 85 more fantasy points than Justin Jefferson.
Wow.
I was a year early on Ja'Marr Chase.
Yeah, you
because
were.
He was my wide receiver 1 last year. And I slightly moved him down because of the contract holdout. Because at one point he was my wide receiver 2. And I said, all right, we're gonna move this back.
Yeah, I was high on Chase. I didn't fade him a lot. And I think what helped me on not fading Chase was that I was fading T. Higgins. And so the passes had to go somewhere. And obviously I was way too high on Andre Yoshi-Boss, who didn't have a bad season, but not the season I wanted him to have. I was way too high on Yoshi, but they had to go somewhere. So I still think I ended up having Chase as my wide receiver 2 or 3. Or no, it wasn't 2 for sure. 3 or 4 is what I meant to say there. So I was high enough on Chase, but Josh, what struck me for Chase is when I was prepping for this show, Chase basically had 1 down game in full PPR scoring this entire season. So he starts the season with 12.2. Not great, but double digits. But Josh, we can talk about double digits here in a second too. Week 2, 7.5. from that point forward, Ja'Marr Chase never hit the single digits again. And unless I'm missing something, he's the only wide receiver you can say that about. And if that's not consistency and that's not MVP, I don't know what is. Can he do it again? I'm certainly not going to fucking say no, because what's crazy is when you look based on what we know about Joe Burrow, based on what we know about Ja'Marr Chase, what about this can he not repeat? Maybe the catch percentage drops a little bit. He caught 127 fucking balls this year. Maybe the touchdowns drop a little bit, but Joe Burrow is going to throw touchdowns. And he finished the season, Josh, with just 13 yards per catch, which is, it's average as can be in the NFL right now. So
yeah, it's pretty average. And it's actually a step up from the last couple of years with Ja'Marr Chase. Like, I mean, he broke out his rookie year, 18 yards per reception. We know that he has that level of ability, but the last couple of years, he's kind of morphed into this like hybrid deep threat / possession receiver, which is kind of how they've been using him in this offense.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of that is because we know how good he is from a yak perspective, how many tackles he can break, because when he has the ball in his hands, he's like a running back. And that's how he plays. So, but he has the speed where he can just break away from everybody. That's what makes him so dynamic. But again, it's been a bump up this year from the 12.2 last year to 13.4, which again is still very middle of the road, I think, when it comes to a lot of wide receivers. I mean, when you look at, the Justin Jeffersons, 14.9, Brian Thomas Jr., 14.7, Lad McConkey, 14, like AJ Brown, 16.1, Jamison Williams, obviously we know he's more of a deep threat, 17.3, Nico Collins, 14.8. Like Ja'Marr Chase is considerably lower than all of those guys from a yards per reception level, but the sheer volume that comes with it, because he is a legitimate wide receiver one. He is a target hog, and he has been from the moment that he stepped onto that field. But when you have Joe Burrow as your quarterback, the sky is the fucking limit, because he's going to throw the football 650 times.
Yep. That's the long and short of it. And Josh, we're going to wrap this one up with the tight ends. I noticed you didn't have a lot of notes on the tight ends, and honestly, neither did I, mainly because I know we're going to talk about Brock Bowers later. Probably the next section. Trey McBride wasn't terribly drafted high. George Kittle and Trey McBride, if I had to guess, were right next to each other. But the long and short of it is, like, the big names didn't do a whole lot, and there wasn't a ton of positional advantage at tight end. So while the great seasons by Bowers, McBride, Kittle were great, the fact that Jonnu Smith kind of put up the same kind of season, I think just kind of in this specific category kind of slows them down a little bit. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you look at like the top three are pretty much grouped together, right? Like Kittle missed
the points per game are crazy between these three.
Yeah, they're basically identical. Like Bowers was the only one of the three that played all 17 games, which is why he ultimately finished as the tight end one. But 15-5, 15-6, 15-8. But then you get down to Jonnu, 13.1. Like there's a clear, tier gap, right? Then you get down to Travis Kelce, 12.2. Then you get down to Mark Andrews, 11.1. Like they're separating themselves here. David Njoku sitting at 13.5. Technically, he's the tight end 4 on the year when you factor in points per game. He just missed quite a few games because he only played 11 on the season. But the tried and true guys that we're consistently drafting, there's just not a need to draft tight ends high right now at all, because they're not creating any level of positional advantage. Sure, maybe in best ball, it makes a little bit more sense to spend that 3rd round pick or something on a Bowers, a McBride, a Kittle, whatever it may be. But outside of that, just wait.
I'm going to quickly throw the chat up here. So Josh noticed at the beginning of the show, the color seemed off on my camera, and apparently it is causing my shirt to change as well. So anybody watching the show on psychedelics right now is just not having a great time with what's going on with my camera and everything. So Josh, we didn't have a whole lot of questions. We did have people throwing their players in. So I wanted to get these guys up on the screen, but just know a lot of these guys were going to come up elsewhere. So the first two guys, Josh, Chase Brown and Bucky Irving from Vince, while they were great, I don't think I'm looking at these two specifically as like my fantasy MVP this season. I don't know. It just doesn't feel right.
I mean, our next section is all about value, right? These were all like late round guys that spiked, right? Chase Brown finished as the RB10, but he really didn't even get going until week 8. Bucky's been in a split backfield. Yeah, 1,100 rushing yards. You love to see that. He also played Carolina twice.
Yeah.
So again, like there's a lot of value there, but I think from an MVP perspective, it definitely lends itself to much be desired.
Yeah. And then Gator throws in Bucky as well. When we asked about the MVPs, Millie throws in Derrick Henry. I think that's fair.
Absolutely.
Henry falls into that Bijan Robinson. Any other season, we'd be talking this shit out of Derrick Henry. And this year just ain't that year. I like this. It's a James Cook and a JT. JT is going to come up later. We'll talk about him in a later section. And then Joe Ortiz says, Gibbs is his 101 next year. So there's
I get it. I absolutely get it. I mean, and Gator chimes in too. Alvin Kamara had a great season. He was RB5 in points per game, and a lot of people were fading him at the start of the season because
Alvin Kamara was the MVP 6 weeks in. There, you can't convince me otherwise.
Yep,
so
I agree. And the late season injury. It's really sad considering how good Alvin Kamara is and how good he's been. He's never had a 1,000-yard rushing season. He finished with 950 this year because of the groin injury. He didn't play the last 3 games.
Yeah,
it's really sad.
6 weeks in, didn't have a game under 12 fantasy points, and then after that, with a down game at 8, still came back with an 18, 27, 16, 13, 16, 13, 17, and then the late season injury. Yeah, Alvin Kamara could have definitely been more heavily involved in this show if he had showed up for the fantasy playoffs. Before we get into the fantasy playoffs, let's talk about the values. And so these, we were looking for players who at ADP did something special this season. And if you guys have anybody names that we're going to miss, make sure you drop them in the chat. Josh will drop the question in there for you. So looking at the value, these were the names that came to mind for us. Jayden Daniels comes off the board as the QB12 in the offseason, finishes as the QB3. Baker Mayfield, QB21, finishes as the QB5. Sam Darnold, QB31. I'm shocked he even had an ADP. Kudos to Josh on that. Finishes as the QB7. Chuba Hubbard, RB43, finishes as the 14. Chase Brown, we talked about, RB37, finishes as the 10. Bucky Irving, RB53, finishes as the 13. Brian Thomas Jr., wide receiver 49, nobody believed, finishes as the wide receiver 4. Less of a value, but still a value. Malik Neighbors, wide receiver 24 drafted, wide receiver 6 finished, but he was 4 in points per game. Terry McLaurin, we weren't sure if Jayden Daniels was going to be the unlock. Drafted as the wide receiver 31, finishes as the 7. Jaxon Smith-Njigba, after a quiet rookie year, we weren't sure what we were going to get. Drafted as the 42, finishes as the 9. Jerry Jeudy, just a shock, plain and simple. Drafted as the 56, finishes as the 12th.
I need everybody to know how much it pained me to write that.
In the show sheet. Little lad McConkey, drafted as the 44, finishes as the 13. And Josh, what has to be the biggest shocker? Jonnu Smith, apparently the biggest part of that Miami offense, drafted as the 26, finishes as the 4. I would have also included Brock Bowers here. My late research, if I remember correctly, drafted as the 11, finished as the 1. I feel like he fits really nicely into this section. But Josh, going back up to these quarterbacks, you could argue Sam Darnold being the most surprising, Baker Mayfield hitting 40 touchdowns. But I think my favorite about this is because it's kind of a victory lap for our show. When everybody wanted Anthony Richardson, we said, don't get Anthony Richardson. Wait 7 rounds and take Jayden Daniels. And oh boy, did that look like genius advice.
Yeah. Everybody spent 5th round, 6th round pick on Anthony Richardson. You could have waited to round 10 and gotten Jayden Daniels at 102 overall. Yeah, I mean, I really don't know what else to say. I mean, he finished as a QB3. Clearly the upside was there. Even when I did my projections, I think I only had him at like 2,800 passing yards. So I was a little bit down on him from that. That's
what killed him in my projections as well.
It was his overall passing yards. Like I wasn't expecting 3,500. We knew the 800 plus rushing yard upside was there.
I worked him up to 1,000, I think, by the time my projections were said and done. Like that's what I thought he was. So
when I did mine, I had him at, what I have him at? Shit, where's the rushing? I had him at 803, so I really wasn't that far off from a rushing perspective. But again, I only had him at 3,100 or so passing yards and only 19 passing touchdowns. So again, he ended up blossoming into more of a passer than I think that we thought anyway.
Yeah.
Which, you know what? That's awesome, because for as much as we talk about rushing upside being great, you need to be able to pair that with a quality arm. And that was why we were out on Anthony Richardson. He could not hit the broadside of a barn standing 3 feet in front of it. Okay?
No
it
lies
is not
detected.
rocket science. If you can't throw the football, you cannot be a successful quarterback in the NFL, because the way that the NFL has evolved, passing matters.
Yeah.
It's literally why Joe Burrow finishes as the QB4 without any level of rushing upside, because of his arm.
Yeah. Like I said, I think Darnold needs a ton of credit. I think Baker Mayfield going for the 40 touchdowns needs a ton of credit. But Josh, I think we're also going to get beat up by our chat if we at least don't throw a little bit of Bo Nix love in here. I don't know exactly what his ADP was, but my man finished as the QB7, 3,700 yards, 29 touchdowns. But I think most surprising for most of us, Josh, 430 rushing yards and 4 touchdowns out of Bo Nix.
QB23 ADP.
QB23 ADP.
Yeah,
I knew Millie was.
He definitely
I knew Millie was going to get mad
and doing this. Yeah.
Yep.
So, the biggest shocker with Bo Nix was the rushing upside. I don't think any of us saw that level of upside from a rushing perspective. I had him statted out for 206 rushing yards, and he finished with double that. Quite literally, because I had him at 206 and 2 touchdowns. He had 430 and 4. And like that, again, that elevates it, right? You didn't really know what he was going to provide from a passing perspective. We all knew what the ceiling was, because we all said he was, degrees light fitting into this Sean Payton offense. But none of us really expected him to get there this year. And after about 3-4 weeks, it all started to pick up. And
after that Sean Payton fight on the sideline, that kid became a pro that day, plain and simple.
Absolutely.
What's funny, Josh, is we're not going to give a ton of time to this section because we talked about a lot of guys in the previous sections. But when I think about fantasy MVP, I think this section and the next section matter more than the full season production. Because when I think about guys, I know for a fact there are people out there pointing to Baker Mayfield right now as the reason they won to or got to a championship. Same thing for Jayden Daniels. And when we move on to these running backs, it already came up in the chat. Bucky Irving is a guy that, again, we doubt. Apparently it was just not a good year for believing in Oregon players. Bucky Irving was a guy we doubted mainly because we didn't know how they were going to use him with Rachaad White, and we saw such inefficiency from the Tampa Bay running game. But Bucky Irving said that was a Leonard Fournette problem. That wasn't a Bucky Irving problem.
Well, and you know what? Hats off to Liam Cohen too. The Bucs have been perennially terrible at running the football. Their offensive line has been awful. They went out and they've invested. We know about Tristan Wirfs. The Barton kid they got from Duke has been a godsend for this line. They went from, I think it was 23rd in rushing last year to 4th this year. Like, that is a massive leap. So hats off to Liam Cohen, hats off to the offensive line, and obviously hats off to Bucky Irving, because that kid is absolutely fun to watch.
Not to pour water on Bucky Irving, because again, very early in my running back rankings, Josh, I have trouble thinking of 5 running backs I'm going to take over Bucky Irving next year, or 6 running backs. I think what keeps Bucky Irving out of the MVP race, and nobody wants to hear why he's not, but the slow start and the terrible week 14. I just think these two things that people are thinking back to are what's going to keep Bucky Irving out of that MVP race. At least,
100%. I mean, I love Bucky. I've grabbed him everywhere. I mean, he was an early stash, mid-season pickup. Like, you love to see that. It obviously wasn't. There were a lot of people that faded him because he fell to the 4th round. But like, all the stars aligned, because let's face it, Rachaad White sucks.
Yeah, I think
he had a clear path.
Yeah,
it just took him a little longer to overtake him.
It's also hard to call Bucky Irving an MVP in a world where Chuba Hubbard exists, because like, he kind of did the same exact thing, and he was also infinitely more cheap in most drafts. So and that was a lot of people being afraid. I guess it wasn't infinitely more cheap. Bucky was actually 10 picks cheaper.
10 rounds cheaper.
Yeah, I'm wrong about that, but that's fine.
Ultimately finished 1 pick higher, but again, Chuba missed the last 2 weeks. So
yeah.
But again, like, if you're not there in the fantasy playoffs helping people win, are you really an MVP at that point? So I think that's kind of where Chuba Hubbard's stock sort of falters a little bit.
Josh, when we look at these wide receivers, I think the names we can cross off immediately, and I don't mean cross off as MVPs, but like we did not project rookies to do as well as they did. So Brian Thomas was a value. Malik Neighbors was a value. Ladd McConkey was a value. But I think a guy that caught everybody but our good friend Hoove by storm was Jaxon Smith-Njigba, because this kid could not have been more average as a rookie. And now all of a sudden he's that guy. Now all of a sudden he is the final nail in Tyler Lockett's grave.
Yeah, I mean, I talked a lot about how high I was on this Seattle offense. Ryan Grubb coming in, University of Washington, how they spread the football around and how much they were going to throw it. They did exactly that. Geno Smith, I believe, was 4th or 5th in the NFL in passing yards this year. And that's Geno Smith. Now, just imagine if they had a good quarterback, right?
Yeah.
This offense could have been so good, which baffles me why Mike McDonald decided to fire Ryan Grubb. Believe me, Ryan Grubb was not the offensive problem, but I digress. For all my love of DK Metcalf, whoops.
Yeah.
Should have flipped that, because JSN was clearly the guy that needed to shine in this offense, not so much the outside threat. But again, I think it was just a matter. It was really the biggest factor was Geno wasn't throwing touchdowns.
Yeah.
The offense was creating yards. They weren't finishing. And maybe that's why Ryan Grubb got fired, because he, was great between the 20s, but couldn't get it done in the red zone. They weren't hitting DK down the seams, giving him opportunities for these contested catches in the red zone. The things that DK does well wasn't there. The things that JSN does well was there for the taking. And Geno said, go on, homie, take it. It's yours. And that's what happened. We got a top 10 season from somebody you drafted to be your wide receiver 5 in some instances.
Yeah. And then the only tight end we really had on the list, Josh, and there's not a ton to say about him, but it's Jonnu Smith. The guy, we're going to say he had an ADP of tight end 26. Jonnu Smith was not being drafted. Finishes as the tight end 4, Josh. Finishes as a huge part of this offense in what was a wild season for the Miami offense. We saw the first ever, in my opinion, QB dependent running back in Devon Achane, but Jonnu Smith goes out with 111 targets and catches 88 of them. Josh, it only took 4 teams to figure out how to use Jonnu Smith properly.
Well, and this is what I find hilarious, right? So obviously we know Jonnu started with the Titans. Well, he came in behind Delanie Walker. Remember how good Delanie Walker was for a good chunk of time?
Yeah.
He had about 8 years where he didn't do jack shit.
That's fair. So Jonnu Smith was in the Delanie Walker.
That's the blueprint for what to do to be good from Delanie Walker. But Jonnu's always been arguably the most athletic tight end.
So athletic, exactly.
The things that he can do with the football in his hands, it was only a matter of time. When he signed in Miami, it was, does Mike McDaniel have his George Kittle for his version of the San Francisco offense, right? Turns out, yeah, he does. He's doing it.
Yeah.
Jalen Waddle consistently hurt, not productive. We know what Devon Achane can do, especially as a wide receiver, which, fun note, if you want to worry about 300 touches, little old Devon Achane, right up about 280 something.
Oh, yeah, that's worrisome. Josh, before we move on to the playoff, is Jonnu draftable next year?
100% he's draftable.
Okay.
100%. But again, there's still an offseason to shake up, right? Like, I'm not going through and looking at the tight end position now and saying, I'm going to draft Jonnu over like David Njoku. I'm not going to draft him over a Mark Andrews. Would I take him over Travis Kelce? Yeah.
What about Evan Ingram? I feel like Jonnu has, in this role.
I want to know who's going to be the offensive coordinator.
There's that too.
Or a head coach that calls offensive plays. That's what I want to know when it comes to Evan Ingram, because it's pretty clear that Jacksonville and Trevor Lawrence like throwing him the football. But how does the rest of that wide receiver core shake out, right?
Yep.
Do they bring Christian Kirk back? Do they just cut bait on Gabe Davis and say, we wasted money? All right, it is what it is. Get out from under it now. Like, there's a lot of room for me to be really in on Evan Ingram, but also really out on Evan Ingram. So if you're asking me right now, I would take Jonnu over Evan Ingram.
There you go. All right. Not a lot of comments on that one. Most of them are just agreeing with what we said. So I'm going to move on to playoff production. And for this one, we looked at PPR scoring weeks 15 through 17. And we wanted just to see what the production was like. And Josh, I was putting together a little playoff bowl. And I noticed for a ton of these guys, they averaged more in the playoffs than they did in the actual regular season. So they certainly came on when the time was right. And I think that's the definition of an MVP. It's just, did they help get you there? Jayden Daniels, almost 31 points per game. Jared Goff, almost 31 points per game. Obviously, Lamar Jackson, 29. Baker Mayfield put up those same points per game in the fantasy playoffs. And guess what? So did Jahmyr Gibbs, and he's a running back, folks. He's scoring quarterback points.
And mind you, that week 18 doesn't factor into that.
This is 15 through 17. Jonathan Taylor, 25.8. James Cook, 21.7. Bijan Robinson, 21.2. Brian Thomas Jr., 28.2 fantasy points in the playoffs. T. Higgins, 26.6. Mike Evans, 26.2. Amon-Ra St. Brown, 25.4. Malik Neighbors, 24.7. And then just the dip at tight end in total points, but still some decent production in the playoffs. Trey McBride, 17.7. Sam LaPorta decides to show up at about 17 points per game, and George Kittle keeps it going at 16 points per game. Josh, this is the segment where we have to talk about Baker Mayfield. He was a draft value, but more importantly, Tampa Bay was fighting for a playoff spot in the fantasy playoffs, and it worked out really well for fantasy managers.
Yeah, Baker has been balling all year. I mean, really the biggest knock on Baker has been the turnovers all year. Like he's basically doing his best Brett Favre impersonation minus the dick pics. And he's looking the part. Like he has zero issues throwing it. Sorry.
I'm just going to say, knowing Baker Mayfield, there's some dick pics out there.
But at least they're unreleased. That's what matters most.
Exactly. Oh my God. That caught me by surprise.
But like, considering losing Chris Godwin and then what Baker was still able to do, that to me is the definition of an MVP. That's the guy that puts the team on your back and says, I got this. Mike Evans, down. Yes, they lost some games, but he did not stop throwing the football.
Yep.
We're talking about Jalen McMillan because Baker Mayfield found a way to get him the football.
Millie said that Baker wasn't fighting for the playoffs because gave him the playoffs.
I mean, look, the Bucks definitely lost some games that really kind of show that maybe they didn't really want to get into the playoffs. Yeah. But again, like that happens when you're down your top two wide receivers and you gotta, you're slapping duct tape on the broken glass, hoping that it doesn't leak. Like it's prime and ready for an infomercial, right? Like it's not rocket science. Like you lose good players, you're not going to perform that well. But Baker found a way to navigate it. That's what kept the Bucks in the playoff race, and that's what kept your fantasy teams in the playoff race.
Yeah. Josh, moving on to Jahmyr Gibbs, you bring up such an interesting point that he did what he did without week 18. I decided to go and add week 18 back in. He outscored all the quarterbacks. His average, if you throw week 18 in, 31.5 from week 15 to 18.
Jesus.
Jahmyr Gibbs, I basically joked, Jahmyr Gibbs can't be Christian McCaffrey, and Jahmyr Gibbs took that personally.
Dude, Jahmyr Gibbs was just a straight up baller this year. Like there's no two ways about it. Like I said, I mean, even the really good running back seasons that we've had, the 380s, the 390s, over 400s, like Gibbs coming in with like 362 total. It's a good season. It really is. But I don't even think he was the most valuable running back this year. That's kind of where I'm at. Like, did he win you a championship? 1,000%. But he did a great job trying to lose it in week 16 because they only had 12 fantasy points.
Who?
Jahmyr Gibbs.
Jahmyr Gibbs had 25.4 in week 16.
Maybe it was week 15. I'm thinking about that.
Nope. Because I was just going to bring up about Gibbs. No,
you know what I'm thinking of? I was checking the scores at like halftime or something.
Oh, and you got something stuck in your head. Yep, that happens. I do that too. Because what I was going to bring up, Josh, is the one thing Gibbs does that kind of sets him apart completely in this category, because the chat has brought up Jonathan Taylor. And obviously we remember what Taylor did in 16 and then again in 17. But the problem is Jonathan Taylor had 10 points in week 15. There's a good chance you didn't get to week 16 if you had Jonathan Taylor. Jahmyr Gibbs, no fewer than 25 fantasy points in the whole playoff run. Nobody else did anything like that. James Cook started off super hot, gives you 11 in the championship. Bijan Robinson only 14 in week 15, 24 and 24 in the next 2 weeks. Tyjae Spears, which is hilarious, he's in this conversation, 13 in the championship.
I almost put him in there, but I'm just like, it's that picture of the 3 guys in the military, and then you see the clown standing behind him. Like, that's what it felt like.
That's Tyjae Spears.
Tyjae Spears into this.
James Conner obviously hurt 3 points in championship week. Amir Abdullah might have been the most consistent guy not named Jahmyr Gibbs. 19, 19, 17. Amir Abdullah deserves a lot of credit. The problem is, Josh, and I think you and I can both attest to this, not a lot of people had enough balls to start Amir Abdullah unless you were in a dire strait. So what Jahmyr Gibbs did
us and started Sincere McCormick.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah, I don't know why we had to bring that up. But Jahmyr Gibbs, the 28, 25, 26. That's exactly what you want from a guy who probably got you to the championship and then handled his business when it came time to handle his business. And Josh, we didn't get a chance to talk about him, and we love bringing up the fact that he did it with Mac Jones at quarterback. And I don't know if that's a good thing for next year or a bad thing for next year, but Brian Thomas Jr. was the number 1 wide receiver in the fantasy playoffs, did not score fewer than 23 fantasy points, Josh.
There was a stretch from when he came back in week 11. Because again, remember, he was dealing with, I think it was like a rib injury or something.
And I'll never forget, Josh, because it happened to like 3 players this year. When he originally went down, one of the pundits said it was a 4 to 6 week injury, and I immediately faded
like 2 to 4 or something like that.
2 to 4 it might have been. I immediately faded the shit out of Brian Thomas Jr. And while he was slow, he was still fucking good. So
from week 11 on, he did not score fewer than 13.6 fantasy points.
Incredible. And then just to turn it on in the playoffs.
And he had what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 total games this year where he scored 20 or more fantasy points, but only 1 over 30. Wow. So, I mean, you could argue that, I mean, outside of like the really, really down weeks where he was trying to soldier through playing hurt, he was really freaking consistent as a wide receiver in this league, especially considering the quarterbacks that he had thrown them the football.
Yeah. I wanted to hit on T. Higgins because someone in the chat brought up how T. Higgins won him a fantasy championship. And what I love about what Higgins did was he was so consistent in 15 and 16 that you never had to worry about starting him. 19.8, 19.8. And then Mike Evans, the championship with 40 fantasy points in the championship. That's exactly what you're hoping for out of a guy who had proven to you he had gotten over some of the hiccups of the past and was ready to be a permanent starter for you.
Yeah, Higgins was really interesting because, again, like he was limping into that championship too. Like he was questionable going into it. And I remember that start-sit episode because you were really hesitant. You're like, man, he's going to come in. He's going to pull a T. Higgins. And
I said, I don't start questionable T. Higgins. And I look like an asshole, but I stick to my rules.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those, burn me once, shame on me, burn me twice, shame on you kind of things. And like, that's kind of what it's been for T. But again, like even when you look at his season as a whole, like he didn't have 900 receiving yards.
Yeah.
What buoyed him was the fact that Joe Burrow had an all-star season. Like, I mean, 4,900 yards and 42 touchdowns. Like that's going to prop up people in his vicinity. Like, we know what it helped do for Jamar Chase, but that stretched down to T. Higgins as well, and it certainly helped win you championships if you stuck with him.
Yeah. A couple other names, Josh, I found interesting. Jameson Williams was the wide receiver 9 in the playoffs. Not a great week 15 with 12 fantasy points, but 26 and 24. I always joke that I won't start guys like Jameson Williams because you never know what you're going to get from him. But at least for that 2-week stretch, he was good. You brought to note Xavier Worthy, 19 or more fantasy points in every game of the fantasy playoffs. Again, he's almost the Amir Abdullah, if you will, where he got really consistent for those 3 weeks as long as you had the courage to start him. And then I would be remiss if we did not talk about Jalen McMillan, who absolutely became a household name for most fantasy managers during the fantasy playoffs. He was still a free agent in most fantasy leagues around week 13, 14, Josh. Fantasy playoffs, 18 points, 16 points, 23 points, benefiting from all that Baker Mayfield throwing that we talked about earlier in the show.
Absolutely. Jalen McMillan is going to be a fun name to watch for 2025 simply because Chris Godwin's contract status is up in the air on top of coming back from the torn ACL.
There you go. And Josh, when we look at the tight ends, there was not a more Jekyll and Hyde performance this season than Sam LaPorta. And it's interesting because he was the tight end 2 in the playoffs. I would love to know how many people were still starting him. I mean, I guess after he popped in week 15, as long as you won, you were keeping him in your lineup at that point. But what a season.
Yeah, I mean, everybody was so high on him. Dynasty tight end 1, redraft tight end 1 because he finished tight end 1 as a rookie. Like I even had him as my tight end 6. Like I'm like, yo,
yeah, you faded him.
They're trying to get Jameson Williams involved in this offense. Guess what happened? They're the only team in NFL history to have not 1, but 2 running backs finishes with over 1,000 yards, and 2 wide receivers have over 1,000 yards.
Interesting.
That is a lot. So it leaves a lot to be desired if you're Sam LaPorta. But, oh, by the way, Sam LaPorta still had 726 yards. So he wasn't like a complete afterthought, but everybody said touchdowns, touchdowns, touchdowns. That's where he came back to reality. He only had 7 this year as opposed to, I believe, 10 last year.
Yep.
He finished as a tight end 8 overall. Clearly, if you stuck with him, which, again, if you stuck with him as your tight end and you finished in a championship, I need to see how you manage that team because there's no fucking way you got there with Sam LaPorta. Let's be real here.
Yeah. Yeah, I was playing in the toilet bowl with Sam LaPorta, and he kept me from taking that crown. So thank you, Sam LaPorta. I appreciate that. Josh, one last interesting note I'll throw out for the tight ends. LaPorta, Kittle, Chigakonkwo, Jonnu Smith, and Mark Andrews, the only tight ends to score double-digit points in every game of the fantasy playoffs. I found that pretty interesting. Trey McBride, not to take anything away from, had that terrible week 16, but nobody was benching Trey McBride. And then he probably won everybody a ton of championships with that monster
30 points
week 17, 30 fantasy point matchup. Josh, that is bringing us to the conclusion of the show, where we are going to name the MVP. I do want to throw Matt Vince's comment up here. Shout out to Joe Milton for the MVP performance in week 18. Yeah, I saw that. That said someone just needs to name him the starter so we can see plays like that for an entire season. Josh, I got a lot of shit for liking Joe Milton because I get a hard on for these strong arm quarterbacks, but that was fun to watch in week 18.
It really was. He's a fun quarterback to watch.
Oh, shit. I'm going to throw this up right now. Dude who won Joe Ortiz's home league had Sam LaPorta at tight end. So I find that surprising and interesting. So
he must have had a hell of a position player roster outside of that because, I mean, LaPorta wasn't giving you anything for the first 8 weeks of the season.
Yeah. So Josh, how you had us break this down was we were each going to nominate 3 players and we're going to pick our MVP for the season out of these 3 players. And Joe kind of went chalk. And we're not going to explain Joe's. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to break down your 3. So Joe said Saquon Barkley, Ja'Marr Chase, Jahmyr Gibbs. I don't think there's any explanation that needs to be given for those 3. I'll let you announce your 3 and kind of give just a brief explanation for anybody who you feel like you have a few more notes to add in there.
Yeah, my top 3 are Ja'Marr Chase, Jayden Daniels, Brian Thomas Jr. Went with a couple of rookies. Really just boils down to the value and where they finished, and especially how they helped you in the championships, because both of those guys absolutely lit it up championship seasoned in the playoffs. Daniels being the QB 12, finishing as a top 3 option. Brian Thomas Jr. not even on radars. But when you look at the average ADP at the wide receiver position, let's say you drafted, I don't know, Tyreek Hill.
I was thinking the same thing, Josh. I was thinking
if you landed Brian Thomas Jr., you got Tyreek production, and that saved your season, and that's what helped you win a championship, right? So that's why I put Brian Thomas Jr. in this conversation, because really he saved you from those early season injuries or ineffective performances from some of these highly drafted guys. And of course, Ja'Marr Chase. I mean, anytime you're creating a positional advantage from a key position and scoring the amount of points that he is, that's an MVP worthy season. I didn't want to go too biased when it came to Saquon, but when you look at the running back position, there's a group of four there. There's Henry, there's Bijan, there's Saquon, there's Gibbs. Saquon didn't really separate himself from that group, so that's why I didn't want to consider him in that MVP kind of conversation. Yeah. But Jahmyr Gibbs 1000% did, especially because, like I said, there were probably some home league drafts that took place where you likely got Ja'Marr Chase as a value because people were scared of the holdout.
And that's what I wanted to bring up for Chase was one of the few people drafted in round one who just absolutely did what he was supposed to do. And for a year where round one was such a landmine, to get what you got out of Chase, out of your first round pick, it felt Christian McCaffrey-esque. It's what you're hoping for when you make these big picks. So that's why Ja'Marr Chase is on my list. I agree so wholeheartedly on Jayden Daniels, because this is a big victory lap show. And we told people, go get Jayden Daniels. This kid is not Anthony Richardson. He's not just this twig. He can throw the ball. We didn't know he could throw it as well as he did, but he held it down. And then for me, Josh, it's another victory lap. It's Brock Bowers, just because I saw the disconnect where I don't watch college football, but people who love college football before the draft were telling me this kid is fucking great and generational and can do everything. And then, Josh, the only knock I heard on Brock Bowers was size, but then I saw that he was the exact same size as Sam LaPorta, who was the tight end one the year before. And I'm like,
honestly, what did Brock Bowers in? He took a picture standing next to Gronk. I swear to God, that is what did in Brock Bowers, because you look at him and he looks like a miniature figurine that should be on a Monopoly board next to Gronk. Like, it's unfathomable to me that they let that one picture sway them off of Brock Bowers.
But yeah, so Josh, again, I do a lot of scorecard and stat lines and all that when it comes to these college players. I watch film. I don't pretend to be an expert on film. When I watched Brock Bowers, this is going to sound like it was a diss, but it wasn't. My first thought was, he's a slow wide receiver. Well, guess what? That fucking works at tight end. And so then I went and I heard about the size from people smarter than me. And then I went and saw that his measurables on paper were the exact same as Sam LaPorta. And so that erased that for me. I was like, okay, well, I'm not worried about that at all. And so all of a sudden we get to draft day and he gets drafted by the Raiders and everybody's up in arms about it and then wants to let him fall in redraft season. And I'm like, I think we're fucking up here. And it turns out I was right. So that's why he made my list. But Josh, if you've been paying attention, folks, one name appeared on all three of our list, which means this year's fantasy MVP is Cincinnati Bengal, Ja'Marr Chase. How could he not be? Josh, the whole show was about him. Do you have anything to add before we get out of here?
I really don't. I mean, anytime you're talking about leaps and bounds above everybody else, like, that's what you want from a fantasy football draft pick. Ja'Marr Chase personified that this year. And guys, this man is about to get paid.
And anybody holding on to the pipe dream that they got together and figured out a way to keep T. Higgins in Cincinnati, you are out of your fucking mind. He gone, because Ja'Marr Chase is getting both those contracts.
Yep.
Guys, you crushed it in the chat. I appreciate it. You guys made me laugh fighting with each other. You made me laugh telling us we're idiots. Thank you guys so much. Guess what? We're back at it again next week. And from what I understand, no Joe Zolo again. So it's going to be me and Josh talking about the fantasy LVPs. Those are the busts, the least valuable players. It's the Christian McCaffreys and everybody like him. Next week is going to be a very hateful show. Tune in for a very, very special episode. And again, guys, this show's not going anywhere. Every single Wednesday at 9 p.m., you're going to get No Punt Intended. Make sure you tune in. Make sure you like. Make sure you subscribe. We have other shows going on. They're all over the place when it comes to whether they're going on in the offseason or not, but we will have some dynasty content. But Josh, you just recorded a lot of special content. So before we get out of here, make sure people know what's coming on that.
Absolutely. Just because your fantasy football season is over does not mean the fantasy season is over. If you haven't already, play DFS. That's where all the fun is right now during the playoffs. You can also get in via Underdog as well. They do playoff best ball tournaments, but with DFS, DraftKings, FanDuel, you can go through and do showdown slates, and that's what Austin and I record with our show, Oh Captain, My Captain. We're basically breaking down how to build a showdown lineup within each playoff game. And that's kind of what we went through and recorded 6 of them Wednesday. So we'll be releasing those throughout the next few days leading up to the playoff games and so on and so forth. But sign up with DraftKings, and we have leagues where you can actually play these showdown slates against us. So we'll give you all the advice to actually take our money. That's how we play.
we like to give it to you. And shout out to Gator. He, Austin, and Joel Wirt did a playoff best ball show that you can find on the channel right now, where they did one of those best ball drafts and had some great analysis on how you need to build your team, because it's very different from drafting a regular team over there on Underdog. And it was very insightful. And
hey, if you want to play on Underdog, guess what? We got a promo code for you. Go through and sign up using code WOFF, WOFF. Claim your free pick and get a first-time deposit offer up to $1,000 in bonus cash. So go join some of those tournaments that Gator and Joel and Austin talk about. You've got probably a couple more days that you can join in and
till Saturday at 4 o'clock. So yeah,
you got it. So be sure to check out that playoff best ball video, which you can find on the live tab on our YouTube page, and give that a view, and then go hop in some tournaments.
All right, guys, we're going to be back next Wednesday, 9 p.m. Eastern, for the fantasy least valuable players. For Josh, I'm Ryan. You can follow Club Fantasy on all the socials at Club Fantasy FFL. Always remember, defense wins championships. Offense wins fantasy football. We will see you next week for the least valuable players.